Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So what are the reasonable expectations of privacy here? To answer this question, I did an empirical study where I looked at the ICQ network of chat rooms. And what happened is every evening for 2 weeks, I would go into, using a bot of course, would go into a number of chat rooms, and I would walk in with the username chat study. After a minute, I would say whatever my consent condition was, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. And after 5 more minutes, if I hadn't been kicked out yet, I would leave. So the consent conditions, on one hand, I walked in with chat study, said nothing, and left. This is our baseline. In the no consent condition, I walked in and said, hi, we're researchers. We're doing a study on language use in online environments. If you have any questions, or we're recording you, if you have any questions, email this address. Thank you. And didn't say anything else. In the opt-in condition, I said basically the same thing. Hi, we're researchers studying language use. We want to record you. If you're willing to opt in, please type chat study volunteer. Thank you. Here's the email address. Opt-out condition was very similar. We're recording you. If you don't want to be recorded, type this message. And we were really interested in what they said to or about us, or what they did to or about us, based on this.
That was a study.
And this was a study. So pulling up a level here, the ethical issues involved in studying ethics. So it's very difficult to assess risk of a study designed to assess risk of studies of this sort. So we worked very closely with our IRB. For those of you out in the ether there who haven't done university studies, IRBs are institutional review boards. They're basically the ethics boards that look at all human subjects research and really focus on making sure the human subjects are protected. I'll tell you, I am a member of the Georgia Tech IRB, which helps in working very closely with the IRB. But the IRB had a number of suggestions for our study that all made it stronger, I believe. First of all, we took out the chat rooms that appeared to have sensitive topics of discussion based on their name alone. Of course, most chat room names and the topic and the discussion that goes on is not necessarily correlated. But we made that attempt. We also removed all usernames from our log files because that really wasn't important to our study. And we removed any comments from our log files that weren't directed to or about us, because we were not really interested in the content of discussion in these environments. So in the end, we were left with unidentified log files, and the discussions were about us alone. So to analyze this data, I did a hierarchical logistic regression analysis. Basically, I was looking at, in the end, were we kicked out or not? Could we predict whether we were kicked out or not? In the first step, I controlled for order effects, because this took place over 2 weeks. Wanted to make sure that by the end, people hadn't just heard about us and hated us. Controlled for the size and number of moderators, and then looked at the message conditions. In addition to this, I did a content analysis of the various comments that were directed at us. Now, the answer is, in general, they hated us. When we said nothing in our control condition, we were kicked out about 30% of the time. When we said anything, regardless of which condition it was, we were kicked out about 65% of the time. And I'll tell you, the messages were a little bit hostile. My favorite quote, I was telling these guys earlier, is, yo mama so ugly she turned Medusa to stone. So in case you need a good yo mama joke. We were particularly interested in whether or not opt-in was a viable method of doing this sort of research. And the results seem to indicate probably not. There were 766 subjects in the opt-in condition. 4 of them opted in. And again, we were kicked out of 65% of the chat rooms in that condition, too. Also, not surprisingly, smaller chat rooms are more hostile than larger chat rooms. for every additional 13 participants in a chat room, our chances of being kicked out were cut in half. So, yes?
I haven't done chat rooms recently. What is the chance of you being kicked out with a different username logging in? Do you think it...
I didn't do that study. That's an interesting condition. I suspect it's probably going to be close to the 30% mark.
So you think you'd just be kicked out
I
anyway?
think a lot of times I was kicked out of those chat rooms because, imagine it's this room. There are 5 of us in it, and a random stranger walks in. We're going to notice the random stranger. It doesn't matter what their name is. So I think, for very similar reasons, that's probably what happened. It may have been a little bit lower. And probably if I had said something and tried to strike up conversation and pointed out that I knew I was an outsider, then it might have even gone lower than that. Sure. So what does all this mean? It seems clear from the data that the participants have an expectation of privacy. But the question is that reasonable? And that's something we as a research community, that ethics boards need to talk about and decide. This is an ethical decision we have to make. One thing that does seem important, though, is with this much of a hostile reaction, careful oversight is important to making sure this research is done right. IRBs and various ethical bodies can help us work through the sensitive issues of data protection or making sure we have extra care when we're dealing with sensitive topics, making sure that in research settings we can obtain certificates of confidentiality if we're dealing with extremely sensitive topics. In academic settings, formal waivers of consent may be appropriate because harm does appear to be low, but there does appear to be negative reactions. There are negative reactions to obtaining consent. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about some learning research and how this can draw on CSCW findings. So I studied a foreign language learning environment. I developed an environment called IRC Fran, which was basically a chat system. And I'll tell you some of the problems that we encountered in early versions of this were what led to the ethics work. But this was basically a chat system for foreign language learning. The interface had a few additional things to support foreign language learning, like finding the right places to engage in conversations, doing accented characters, but nothing major. Basically an IRC system. And we were looking at second-year French language students. These are the students that have basically, second-year college. These are basically the students who have been exposed to a wide variety of grammatical structures and are now trying to put them all together. And it's the stage where teachers are really attempting to push toward fluency of speech, fluency of interaction. And so the classes tend to be discussion-oriented. They tend to be small. And we looked at a standard classroom, several standard classrooms actually, and very similar online chat discussions with the same students. What you find in the classroom is probably not surprising at all. The teacher comes in, she asks a question, is really trying to get conversation started. It's a thought-provoking question. Students hide their eyes and cower. They don't want to be called on. So the teacher has to pick a victim, gets the victim to respond. There's a little bit of a one-on-one conversation, and then the teacher moves on to another victim. What you see, this is one particular classroom that's pretty typical. The teacher spoke 84% of the time. The students together spoke 16% of the time. Almost all comments were directed at the instructor. There's a little bit of student-to-student discussion, but it's minimal. When these same students and the same teacher go into an online environment and discuss the same types of questions, the pattern reverses. The teacher asks a question, and the students answer it, and they start responding to one another. And the teacher actually has a hard time getting a word in edgewise. The teachers were thrilled by this. There is still, if you look at this, some discrepancy in how much students participate relative to one another. But in general, the baseline is up, and there's much more student-to-student participation. the question is why? Why do we see these things? The CSCW literature offers a number of explanations that all have a certain degree of truth. There are social cues that change when we move online. There are social identities change. So in the classroom, I may view myself more as an individual who's being judged, whereas when I go into an online environment, I am now a member of the group, participating in group discussions rather than acting as an individual. None of these explanations, though, seem to fully capture the data that I was seeing. They all had a certain degree of truth, but none fully captured it. So I went into the social psychology literature and started delving back a little bit and ended up looking at the bystander effect, which is a part of the social loafing literature. In general, social loafing, at least as Corral and Williams describe it, is about getting better quality participation in group environments. It's about getting levels of effort up in participation. Well, the bystander effect is a little bit older. It's a subset that really talks about getting participation in the first place. How do you get people to participate in an activity? And in particular, bystander effect looks at emergency settings and says, why is it that groups inhibit individuals from acting in emergency settings? And there were a number of studies on this. Many of them are really fascinating to read. But one, for example, a group of students were brought into a waiting room. They thought they were going to participate in a study, so they're filling out a questionnaire. When a student is sitting there individually, the experimenter then crosses behind a curtain. The student hears a filing cabinet crashing, and the experimenter saying, "Ow, my leg, my leg." Now, the student sitting there individually looks a little worried, gets up, and checks on the experimenter. When there's somebody else in the room who's trained not to respond, another student filling out a questionnaire, the students will tend to just sit there. The same students who would get up and check on the experimenter will just sit there and do nothing, looking uncomfortable. Surprisingly, when you have that student come with a friend who's not trained to do anything, who should react the same way and check on the experimenter, they both just sit there and don't even talk about it. So group settings inhibit individuals from acting in emergency situations. So looking at this mechanism gives us a way of looking at classrooms, because classrooms are certainly not emergency situations, thankfully. But the same
They're acute, not chronic. No, they're chronic, not acute. Yeah.
True. But the same mechanisms, social and psychological mechanisms that are underlying inhibition in emergency situations, though, might be acting in the classroom. So the bystander effect basically gives us four mechanisms to look at. There are social cues that inhibit action, and I'll talk about those in a minute. There's self-awareness, so fears of being judged, which come out in the classroom that reduce online. There's diffusion of responsibility in any group situation. There's blocking mechanisms that occur. So if I'm talking and we're being polite, you can't be talking at the same time. Whereas in an online environment, we can actually both be typing at the same time. So let me focus in on social cues, just as an example of how this is useful. In the original formulation, social cues in an emergency setting said, if it's ambiguous, I'm going to look at you to see what you're going to do, to figure out if it is an emergency. You're going to look at me, and I'm going to go, well, everybody else is calm. You're going to go, well, he's calm. And so none of us are going to act because we both convinced each other that it's not an emergency. In the classroom, it's not the same thing. And it's not what's typically in the literature with social cues. But rather, what the students expressed concern about was that others are judging them, that they make mistakes, they stutter, they take long pauses, they look up something in the dictionary, and others can see these mistakes. They're actually highlighting their errors for everybody else to see. And they're worried about these social cues that they were giving off. So online, students have much more control over social cues. One student said, if I mess up in class, I kind of look around or I pause. No one can notice that online. I don't stutter online if I mess up a word. I don't have long pauses online. So having this control over self-presentation made the students feel much more comfortable participating in the online environment. The implication here is that if we're trying to design for participation in areas where we think our participants might feel judged, we need to really consider control over self-presentation as a potentially important issue to design for. Before I talk about where this work is headed, let me tell you a brief aside that's just interesting. Unfortunately, I can't claim to have done this research, but there is research that shows text-based interaction in chat environments does improve oral pronunciation skills. The reasoning appears to be that when you are trying to interact in a foreign language, you're trying to come up with the words to say, you're trying to formulate physically how to say them, you're trying to do the translation from your native language to the foreign language. When you're online, you don't have to think about how to say the words. You can focus on just coming up with the right words to say. And that becomes more fluent, requires less effort. So that then when you go to talk, you don't have to put as much mental effort into coming up with what to say, and can rather focus more of your attention on how to say it, which is an interesting result. But foreign language learning provided an ideal place to look at the quantity of discussion. Because after all, the teachers were just thrilled that the students were talking. It didn't matter that sometimes the topics had a lot of intellectual depth, and at other times they were Dawson's Creek. It was fine. The students were talking in the foreign language, which was the main goal. Measures of quality in foreign language interaction tend to be individual. So it's how well I'm putting together my grammatical structures. It's not how well we're working together collaboratively to have a discussion. In other domains, though, that's not true. In other domains, quality becomes a very important issue. What are we talking about? How are we talking about it? And it's unclear, based on the literature, what would happen to quality in an online environment. On one hand, we might be able to argue that reduced inhibition is going to give us better conversations. After all, we're getting a greater number of people involved in the conversation, engaged, a greater variety of ideas out there that are spurring the discussion, and this is great. On the other hand, we might get worse conversation. After all, if I'm talking more, I may be listening less. And I may be engaging in more antisocial behavior, which is, of course, well documented in online environments. So I'm currently looking at, well, what happens? This is work in progress. I'm using a professional ethics environment, senior level computer science course at Georgia Tech. And in this course, the goal is for students to learn to basically think through ethical problems, to be able to see that other people can have well-grounded ethical stances that are different than their own, and it's not just that I'm right and you're wrong. But they want students to be able to see multiple perspectives and reason through these issues. This is a required course, and as computer science has grown, the number of students has grown. We now have 40 to 45 students per section and 3 to 4 sections per semester. The teachers want discussion, but it's just hard. It's just hard with that number of students. So they tend to use a lot of small group discussions. So the teacher cannot be involved in every discussion. The small group discussion the teacher is involved in is great. That one's fine. It's the other 8 discussions that are going on in the same classroom that we don't know about. So what I've been doing is comparing those discussions with small group discussions around the same types of questions with the same students in an online environment. I am looking at a couple of measures of quality, topic digression. So how much do the students actually stay on topic? Teacher gave them that assignment for a reason. How much do they stay on topic? And also a diversity of perspectives. The teachers want the students to engage with a greater variety of ideas. I'm going to step over this, but we can talk about those ideas in more detail later if anybody's interested. So now let me tell the flip side. Let me tell about work in business environments and how viewing them as learning environments can help us understand the design considerations there. So this is work I've done at Pitney Bowes with several guys there, Ben Singer, Jonathan Wolfman, Austin Henderson. Over the time I've been working with them, I've spent a lot of time in hospitals. I've spent a lot of time going through hospital data. And I can talk about any of those things in more detail, but let me tell you about the big problem that happens in hospitals. What happens is doctors go in, they treat a patient, they're thinking clinically the whole time they're there, they're writing in the medical record clinically, and this is great. We want doctors to do that. But after the patient is discharged, the medical record then goes down to the coding department, who open it up and try to code all of the diagnoses and all of the procedures that the doctor has done. And the problem at this point is that the coders are constrained by legal definitions. So if a doctor opens the medical record and writes rehydrate patient, the coder can look and see, okay, the patient's dehydrated. That's why you rehydrate the patient. But if the doctor didn't write dehydration, the coder can't code for it. And this happens over and over again, so the coders either can code for the lesser things, they code whatever the least risk of fraud code is. So rather than, for example, pneumonia with complications, so pneumonia with dehydration would be pneumonia with complications, they just code pneumonia. And they either do that, or they ask doctors questions 2 weeks after the doctor has already seen the patient, and the doctor's seen 15 patients in the meantime and has completely forgotten. And the doctor can't go back to the medical record to look in it because the coder now has the medical record, not the doctor. So hospitals, because of this problem, lose an estimated about $2 billion a year for this, which, given that hospitals work in a margin of about plus or minus 2%, this is the difference between being in the red and black.
So how do they lose money over that issue?
So, for underbilling, pneumonia, so doctors will write pneumonia. This one's actually, I've seen several times now. Doctors will write pneumonia. They won't write the cause because that doesn't matter. The symptoms and the treatment are the same. Pneumonia pays about $7,000 from Medicare. If it's aspiration pneumonia, which means a different cause, and that's typically associated with end of life and several other problems. If they write aspiration pneumonia, that's $14,000, and the coder can code for that. So because the doctor left off that one word, there's $7,000 that's lost. And you make this happen every day at every hospital, the money adds up really quickly, surprisingly quickly. So from the doctor's standpoint, if we focus on the doctors, this really is a learning issue. The doctors want to do the right thing, but they don't have any support to learn how to write better documentation in the medical record. They're thinking clinically. They don't receive any feedback when their documentation is poor. And when they do receive feedback, it's too little, too late. There's very little motivation for doctors to make this change. In the average 300-bed hospital I was working with, they have 1,500 doctors come through there every month, and 7 of them are on staff. So hospitals have very little leverage to motivate the doctors to care more about documentation. To solve this problem, we came up with a system where we basically created an electronic equivalent of the medical record while the patient's still in the hospital. I'm going to be a little intentionally vague on how we did that. But this allowed coders to see the medical record while the patient's still there. If the coder saw something that's a question, she could ask the question to the doctor immediately while the patient's still in the stay. Question would get stuck in the medical record, and next time the doctor opened it, he could answer that question. And I should point out that the social hierarchies here are also a huge issue. Coders are about $30,000 a year employees. Doctors are God. So when you have the two interacting, there may be some issues. So we did a 2-week trial of this system in this one particular hospital. We found that their reimbursement levels went up a lot. So all of this reimbursement gets rolled up into a number that's called a case mix index. Don't worry about how it's calculated, but it's directly correlated to reimbursement from Medicare. While we were there, the case mix index was the highest this hospital had ever seen by more than 2 standard deviations above the mean. They got about an additional $700,000 while we were there. So we have reason to believe that the ideas are good, but it's impossible to separate out Hawthorne effects. We were there in a hospital saying, let's talk about documentation, and documentation got better. Surprise, surprise. So we're currently working on a 3-month trial to try to get at a lot of these issues. The problem that arises, though, is, as you can see, we're completely changing the coder's strategy. The coder has been working in a medical record after the patient's discharged, can work in it as a single unit, close the record, and they're done with it. Now coders are working in medical records every day while the patient's still there. They're now in a case management load, and it's a completely different work process. So one of the big questions that we're working on right now is, how do you support the coders making this change from a work process that happens all after the fact as a self-contained unit to this case management load? I'm going to talk about that more on the next slide. There are also a number of questions this raises about design process. So how do we support the coders? Fortunately, the learning literature tells us a number of things that are really important. It tells us that providing feedback on actions is an important aspect of helping them learn to do this new work process. It tells us that the support they need has to fade over time. They need more support in the beginning when they make the change, and not as much support a year from that when they've begun to internalize the process. It also tells us that the coders need time and provocation to reflect. They need reason to think about what they're doing and to focus on their learning at a meta level. So we're working right now in figuring out how to design a system that will help support our coders given these constraints and given these tools. So let me tell you a little bit about what I see as some future interesting directions to go into. One that I think is really important is informal learning in the workplace. We know that this happens all the time. We're always learning from our colleagues. We're always sharing knowledge. But it's really difficult to support because it's such an informal process. So how do we develop tools to support knowledge sharing among teams, so small groups, but also among larger organizations? Because, for example, here, I'm sure there are lots of pockets of lots of knowledge that are distributed across a huge organization. How do you learn to draw on those different pockets of knowledge? I think looking at organizations as learning environments can give us a lot of insight into how to do this. On the flip side, I think there's a lot of work that's happened in supporting small groups in business environments. And this has been great work. But now how do we take that to learning environments? How do we deal with the fact that learning environments typically have different social structures, they have different goals? How do we take business work and migrate it to learning environments? In my research, I think part of the answer in how to get there is to combine methods. Laboratory-based research is wonderful. It allows us to control a lot of things. It allows us to answer certain questions fairly precisely. And it allows us to generate new hypotheses. But we have to then take those back out into the world. We have to look at the messiness of complex environments to understand how those laboratory-based hypotheses generalize. And we have to use these naturalistic environments to, again, inform questions that we want to ask in the laboratory. And that the answer is really to move back and forth between these methods as a way of trying to answer these bigger questions. So thank you very much for listening. I'll take questions, I think, only from the small audience. Okay. Mark.
Could you go back to the image of the French chat room and give me a sense of if or what the difference between that pattern as a class and the naturally occurring pattern in a so-called typical chat room would be? How different is that from other kinds of chat rooms?
I suspect the pattern is the same. So early on, in one of the early versions of IRC Fran, I basically had students going out there and participating with the native speakers who were already in French chat rooms.
Oh, so you said send second-year French students to French chat rooms.
Right.
Right, okay.
Because it seemed like, authenticity, great.
Right. But then they
Proved to
acted
be
like
a
French
very bad idea. The fact is, the native speakers had very different goals in their conversation than the students. So the native speakers just wanted to have light conversation for fun. They wanted, so therefore they were using terrible grammar, various made-up words. Just from a learning standpoint, what they were doing was not great for the students. So the students didn't feel like they were getting anything out of it. And then the students were talking slowly, so by the time they said a comment, had now really relevance had left. And so the native speakers were upset with the students who were talking slowly and who weren't participating like they should in this conversation. And everybody hated everybody. When we moved to having students interacting with just students, we actually found that the students were much happier. They all shared common goals, which seemed to improve the quality of the discussion. I didn't actually measure quality, so I'm going to hedge there. But from talking with the students, it seemed to be a much better system. So that kind of answers your question, but I'm not sure how the pattern would look.
You're saying here that the big difference is you go from hub and spoke to a mostly densely connected graph.
Right.
And I guess my question is that a feature of chat rooms in general? Are most chat rooms densely connected graphs? Or is this a feature of this instructive environment?
I think most chat rooms probably do have much of this feature among the participants who are actually participating. I think in most chat rooms, though, you also do get a large number of lurkers. And you don't necessarily get the lurker dynamic going on in this educational environment because there is more accountability. But I suspect, ignoring the lurkers, that you would see a fairly similar graph in a reasonable size chat room. If you made it a huge chat room, you might see pockets of densely connected discussion or something. But that's more of gut feeling from my time in the environments and based on the literature I've read. I can't say for sure.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What do you see as the biggest challenge to the 3-month study in the hospital? I don't know if you can talk a little bit more about your research, like the questions that you're going in with or the big challenges there. It sounds like there's some.
Yeah. There are a number of huge challenges. One of the biggest challenges is how do we come out of this being able to say, yes, we made a difference? How do we gather the evidence that allows us to say that, given that hospitals are dynamic, changing environments, given that a lot of the measures of reimbursement are tied to the acuity of the patients. How sick are the patients? And over time, that does change. For example, in January, patients are sicker than they are in August. It's just natural because we get sick in winter months. So the changing dynamics of the patient population are hard. The other big challenge is just starting up this type of system. Because, like I said, there are 1,500 doctors that will come through on an average month. Even if we limited this to one floor of a hospital, there are at least 100 doctors that are going to come through on an average month. Then there's nursing staff. Then there's the back-end operations. So there are a lot of just hard startup questions of how do you practically get this type of trial running in this type of environment. I think one of the hopefully easier but still hard questions is how do you staff this sort of thing and not kill your researchers? I can tell you during the 2-week trial, I was practically living in the hospital. I'd be there 12 to 16-hour days, and you know, when you're not getting much sleep, working in a hospital is not the best environment to be in because there are lots of bugs floating around.
But you were working just like a doctor was.
Yes. Somewhat. Doctors aren't going to spend as much time in the hospital setting. They're going to have a lot of time in their offices.
Yeah, the interns.
The interns.
Residents.
Absolutely.
I've seen that.
Yeah, you've seen that, haven't you?
But so one of the interesting challenges that we had in the 2-week trial was how do we work under those environments where we're really putting in a lot of time making the project work and collecting data at the same time. How do we collect data given that we're putting so much time into this? And one of the strategies that I came up with that I think worked pretty well is before anybody was allowed to leave the hospital, or any of our researchers, they had to...
Not sure if you're well.
Right. They had to come to me, we had to sit down, and they had to debrief on video about the day. Because they obviously weren't going to take 2 hours of ethnographic notes for every hour they were there. So I would basically interview them, debrief them, and get them to talk about all of their experiences on video. So we were able to cull a couple hundred hours of man time into the hospital into about 10 hours of video, which is still a lot of video, but it's much more manageable than 200 hours of written notes. We'll tell you, it's also a challenge when your patients, your subjects are dying on you. We would get attached to these patients, of course. But those are some of the big challenges.
Thanks.
It sounded like you had hit upon a research project that the administration of this hospital, your number one obstacle for entry, was very interested in. If, for example, you have a 3-month re-invite. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hospitals are really interested in this stuff for a couple of reasons. One, it's big money, and that's important to them. The other thing is, this is how hospitals are ranked. So whenever you pick up the U.S. News and World Report, what they're doing is they're taking that case mix index number, which is a measure of how sick patients are, and they're taking mortality rates. And they're saying the hospital that has the same case mix index but a lower mortality rate is the better hospital. So hospitals are being very directly ranked on the quality of their documentation, because everybody believes that case mix index is actually low because of the quality of documentation, not because there is some natural variation. A teaching hospital is going to have sicker patients than a community hospital. But keeping patient populations even, this case mix index is really important because it comes down to publicity. And now, so you get websites like healthgrades.com, which is reporting all of this information. And they're now beginning to put this information out on a doctor level. So doctors are being compared very directly and publicly and saying, you know, these two doctors deal with the same percentage of the same sickness of patients, but this one seems to be killing more of his patients, which is how the public is going to view this data. So hospitals are really interested in this problem, but it's a hard one to solve.
So they have a incentive to declare their caseload far sicker than they would otherwise have been recorded. But then there's a counter pressure from the Medicare people saying, if you claim it's a fraud. Yeah.
If they're caught for fraud,
Right.
the cost is huge.
Just happened
It's
to do that, actually.
enormous.
Yeah.
It just happened at the university hospital.
If they come in and they find you've been doing fraud, they basically assume you've been doing that same level of fraud on all of your patients. And
Not just
will
the
then
computer
say,
language.
you have to give us this much money back.
Right.
And it tends to be huge
Right.
numbers.
So would you say that your system, because of the tighter linkages between the coder and the documenter, the doctor, is more or less fraud resistant? I mean, could they just agree to collude, for example? You see, I don't know. You see a
Right.
cough, I see pneumonia. You see pneumonia, I see bubonic plague. That kind of thing.
I think
That was good. Yeah.
the idea is to get more accurate documentation. And I think you're probably not going to see more fraud because in general, the personalities of everybody involved, imagine the number of people we have to get to collude to start with. But then doctors and especially coders in general tend to have very, very strong senses of ethics. And don't ask them to do anything wrong or you'll be in trouble. It's certainly possible, but I would hope that it would just lead to more accurate documentation.
Hold on, wait. I'm sorry, I'm going to follow. So
Okay.
I guess, though, that to the extent then that this technology is not uniformly deployed, this is a competitive advantage for some hospitals over others.
That's what
The goal
the
is.
business side of this, we hope.
That's not a bug, that's a feature. That's what we say around here. Yeah, okay. Well,
Right.
Well, very interesting.
Nice sticker price.
Yeah.
Other comments?
Okay.
You're good? I'm good. Good.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think we've actually hit an hour.
That's great.